Okay, so we have this rapid depolarization happening. Sodium is coming in to move towards its equilibrium potential of plus 60 millivolts. However, it does not make it all the way there, okay? So let's talk about why it doesn't make it all the way there. We're going to move on to the next step here, okay? So there are two main events that cause the membrane potential to reverse direction once we get to this peak right here of about plus 30 millivolts, okay? The two events are indicated right here. One, sodium channels close, and two, potassium channels open. Why is it not? Okay, so what's going to happen as a result of that? Take a moment to think about that. Hit pause, write that down on your worksheets, and we can talk about it. Okay, so let's talk about what happens, right? So we are closing sodium channels. When we close sodium channels, sodium no longer has as much opportunity to move in such a way as to bring the membrane potential closer to its equilibrium potential. Therefore, that's going to cause this depolarization to end, okay? The other thing that happens is that potassium channels open, okay? So these potassium channels are also voltage gated. They actually started opening at the same time that the sodium channels opened. However, they take longer to open. So that's why we were able to bring in sodium in the rising phase here. It's getting a head start over the potassium, right? So the potassium's starting to open, but they're kind of slow. So really, it's only once we get to this point where they're really starting to open, okay? Once those potassium channels open, then we have a lot more opportunity for potassium to move across the membrane. And which way is it going to move across the membrane? It's going to move out of the cell. Okay, it's going to move out of the cell in order to bring the membrane back down towards its equilibrium potential of negative 90 millivolts. Okay, hopefully you understand that. Right, so we answered this question. Potassium ions are going to move out of the cell, right? Because we're starting at a positive number for membrane potential. We want to bring the membrane potential down towards the potassium equilibrium potential of negative 90. In order to make the membrane potential more negative, we need to move our positively charged potassium ions out of the cell. Okay, so we already talked about this, right? We opened up those potassium channels. That's going to allow potassium to move out of the cell. In the meantime, the sodium channels have closed. So sodium's not really doing anything anymore, or it actually is going to start getting pumped back out by the sodium potassium ATPase. But let's move on. Oh, right. So there's a name for this phase of the action potential. It's called the falling phase or the repolarization phase. Okay. Moving on. So the action potential has this sort of interesting feature right here by the number 7, wherein the membrane potential actually falls below the resting membrane potential. You all see that? See that? It's like negative 75, negative 80 around here, okay? The reason for that is because we have so many potassium channels open. Since we have that many potassium channels open, potassium is really just, it's those potassium ions are really going to go for it. They're going to try to bring the membrane potential down to the potassium equilibrium potential of -90 millivolts. And yes, since so many potassium channels are open, it's going to be able to get pretty close. So it's actually going to be able to pull the membrane potential down farther than the resting membrane potential. Okay. We have a name for this phase of the action potential. It is the after hyperpolarization. I think some people also call it just the hyperpolarization phase. But basically, we're hyperpolarizing the cell beyond its resting membrane potential. Okay. All right. Finally, the end of the membrane, the end of the action potential is basically things return to normal. Okay, so those voltage-gated potassium channels that allow this after hyperpolarization to happen, those start to close, and then less potassium is going to leave the cell as a result, and that's going to bring the membrane potential back up. And yeah, just sort of generally the ion permeabilities are going to return to normal. Sodium potassium ATPase is going to pump sodium and potassium back to their starting positions. So sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. And then that brings us back to our resting membrane potential here. Okay. All right. So this is just a quick, kind of simple, straightforward review of the phases of the action potential. So just kind of take a moment to answer these questions. You'll probably have to hit pause. One, what part is the rising phase? What ion is responsible for this phase? Two, what part is the falling phase? What ion is responsible for this phase? Three, what is the after hyperpolarization and why does it occur? And finally, what is threshold? Okay, so go ahead, hit pause, and we will not discuss it. All right, so I hope you had fun answering these questions. I'm actually not going to go over them in this video because I feel like they're very straightforward. You can just kind of look back at the slides and answer the questions. So I'm not going to do that. I'm trying to keep the video shorter. Okay. But here's an interesting set of scenarios that I want you to consider. What would the action potential look like under each of these conditions? So you should consider each of them separately, okay? What would it look like if the sodium equilibrium potential was plus 30 millivolts instead of what it normally is? What would it look like if the potassium equilibrium potential was 0 millivolts instead of what it usually is, okay? What would the action potential look like if the permeability to potassium never changed? Okay, so I want you now to take what you've learned about the action potential, apply your concepts of permeability, equilibrium potential, membrane potential to think through these different scenarios, okay? And then we will come back together and talk about that in class. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of the phases of the action potential. Here are your learning goals. Here's your vocabulary. See you in the next video.